On the morning of his son's 7th birthday, Wyatt Aldrin walked into the office with a small cake tucked inside his bag. It was nothing, grand white frosting, 7 candles wrapped in a paper sleeve, and a sticky note on the lid that read, "Tonight we blow these out together." He had stopped at a bakery 2 blocks from the office because the one near their apartment had not yet opened when he left the house that morning. He had stood at the counter and pointed to the smallest cake they had, the one with the plain white frosting and no decoration, because Levi had once said he liked the plain ones best, and Wyatt had not forgotten that. He had not asked for the afternoon off yet. He was going to do it quietly, the way he did most things. Slip away at 3, pick Levi up, make it home before the light went soft. That was the entire plan. That was all he needed. Instead, there was a white envelope sitting in the center of his desk. Giselle Monroe stood in the doorway with her arms folded, and 2 security personnel behind her. She did not sit down. She did not offer any preamble. She looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they have already solved, and she said, "I think you know why. Clear your things. You have 15 minutes." Wyatt did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the envelope. He looked at her for a long moment, steady, unhurried, and then he reached into his bag and set the small birthday cake on the corner of his desk. He picked up his personal bag. He nodded once, and then he walked out. What no one in that room understood, not Giselle, not the 2 men behind her, not the colleagues watching through the glass partition, was why he was smiling. It was a small smile, private, the kind that does not belong to the moment in which it appears, but to a moment much further ahead. 90 days later, every single one of them would understand exactly what that smile meant. Wyatt Aldrin had not always worked in operations. 3 years before that morning, he had held a different kind of title, Senior Strategic Advisor, reporting directly to the founder and chairman of Nexara Group, a man named Joseph Harmon. Harmon had built the company over 2 decades from a regional freight business into a logistics and distribution network that moved product across 14 states and cleared $1.2 billion in annual revenue. He was not flashy. He was not often quoted in magazines. He simply understood how money moved and how people moved it, and he had built something lasting because of that understanding. Wyatt had come up under Harmon's eye, the way certain people come up not through favoritism, but through proximity to someone who recognized how a particular mind worked. He could look at a set of financial projections and see not what they said, but what they were hiding. He could walk a warehouse floor for 20 minutes and tell you exactly where the inefficiency lived. Harmon used to say that Wyatt saw corners where other people only saw walls. Then Wyatt's wife died. A car accident on a Tuesday in November, 3 years before the morning with the envelope. She was 31 years old. Levi was 4. Everything that had been the shape of their life together suddenly had a hole in the center of it. And the only thing Wyatt knew with certainty was that he needed to be present, not traveling, not in conference rooms in other cities. Present, in the same house as his son, close enough to hear him if he woke up scared in the middle of the night. So, Wyatt stepped back. He asked Harmon for a lateral transfer director of internal operations, a position with predictable hours, no overnight travel, and a clear enough scope that he could do the work well without it consuming everything else. Harmon had looked at him for a long time before agreeing. He said, "This is temporary, Wyatt. You know that." Wyatt had not answered. He was not sure he believed it. He had been in that role for 3 years when Joseph Harmon semi-retired and the board brought in Giselle Monroe. Nexara was profitable, but not growing fast enough for certain board members who had been watching the expansion moves of competitors with growing impatience. They wanted new energy. They wanted someone who moved quickly and spoke the language of aggressive restructuring. Giselle had spent the previous 8 years running a regional subsidiary of a much larger logistics conglomerate, and she interviewed very well. The vote was 6-3. Harmon had been one of the 3. Wyatt noticed the change within the first few months. Budget lines that had been stable for years were suddenly reclassified. External consulting fees began appearing in quarterly reports, large ones, attached to firm names he had never encountered in any industry context. A contract renewal for the Northern Logistics Division, a piece of the business that accounted for nearly 30% of total operating revenue, was moved from the standard procurement process to a direct negotiation handled exclusively by Giselle's office. He asked questions. He got answers that answered nothing. He asked again, in writing. The written response came from Giselle's chief of staff and cited ongoing strategic review as the reason for the changes. It was the kind of language that meant, stop asking. 2 weeks before Levi's birthday, Wyatt compiled everything he had observed into a formal internal report. He did not route it through Giselle. He sent it directly to the board's independent audit committee, which was his right under the company's governance charter. The report was 41 pages. It documented irregular cash flow patterns over 14 months, consulting expenditures with no corresponding deliverables on file, and a proposed divestiture of the Northern Logistics Division to an entity whose ownership structure he had not been able to fully verify through public records. The report disappeared. That was the word Charlotte Voss used when she slipped the folded note into his hand in the hallway on the morning he was fired. Not lost. Disappeared. He sat in his car in the parking structure for 3 minutes after walking out. The engine was off. The small birthday cake was on the passenger seat. He unfolded Charlotte's note and read the single line written in her careful, even handwriting. The report wasn't lost. It was redirected. Be careful. He folded the note and put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at the cake, then he picked up his phone and called home. The woman who watched Levi during the day answered on the second ring. Levi was napping, she said. Wyatt asked her to tell him that his father would be home early, that tonight was still his birthday, that they were still blowing out the candles. He started the car. He did not feel broken. He felt something else, a clarity that arrives sometimes when the last thing holding you in place is suddenly removed. He was no longer bound by an employment agreement. He was no longer required to route his concerns through internal channels. He had a copy of his report saved on a personal encrypted drive because he had not survived 3 years as a single father without learning to keep backups of the things that mattered. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He knew exactly who could do something about it. And for the first time in a very long time, he had nothing but time. That evening, Levi sat at the kitchen table in front of 7 candles. His face lit gold in the small, warm glow, and he squinted his eyes the way children do when they are thinking very hard about a wish. Wyatt took a photograph. The shutter sound was the quietest thing in the apartment. Then Levi blew, and 6 of the 7 candles went out, and he laughed at the one still burning and blew again, harder, and got it. They ate cake at the kitchen table. Levi talked about a game he had invented at school involving a rope and a set of rules that changed every few minutes. Wyatt listened. When the plates were cleared, Levi rested his chin on his hands and looked at his father with the particular directness that 7-year-olds sometimes have, the kind that has not yet learned to look away from difficult things. Did something happen today, Dad? Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He had considered what to say on the drive home, turning the words over. He had decided, somewhere on the highway, that he would not lie to his son about things that were real. I lost my job today, he said. Levi considered this seriously. So what are you going to do now? I'm going to do something I should have done a long time ago. Levi seemed to accept this. He looked at the remaining slice of cake, then back at his father. Will it take a long time? Maybe 90 days, Wyatt said. He did not know, in that moment, where that number came from. It simply arrived. After Levi was asleep, Wyatt sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and a glass of water. He opened the encrypted drive. He opened the report. He read through it again slowly, not because he had forgotten anything, but because he needed to see it all at once, the full shape of what Giselle Monroe had been building inside the company that Joseph Harmon had spent 20 years constructing. The Northern Division divestiture was the center of it. The deal, as structured, would sell that division for $140 million to an entity called Vantage Capital Partners, LLC, registered in Delaware, whose listed principals were 2 attorneys, with no traceable background in logistics or distribution. Wyatt had spent 3 evenings with public records databases before filing his report. The trail was careful, but it was there. Vantage Capital Partners had received 2 substantial wire transfers in the 18 months prior from an offshore holding company. That holding company shared a registered agent with a personal investment vehicle that Giselle Monroe had disclosed in her initial background filing with the board disclosed and then apparently never examined. She was selling a piece of the company to herself. At 11:47 that night, Wyatt picked up his phone and dialed a number he had not called in 3 years. It rang 4 times. Then a voice answered, older, a little rougher than he remembered, but unmistakably warm. Wyatt. Not a question. Just the name, spoke in the way someone speaks the name of a person they have been half expecting to hear from. Mr. Harmon, Wyatt said, I need you to know what's happening inside Nexara. I think you've suspected something for a while. A long pause on the other end. Then, my house. Tomorrow. 9 o'clock. Wyatt closed the laptop. He stood up and turned off the kitchen light. He stood in the dark for a moment, looking at the photograph of Levi and the 7 candles still on his phone screen, the boy's face bright and completely unworried. There were certain things that could not be taken from a person regardless of what else was stripped away. He had learned that 3 years ago. He was learning it again now. This was day 0. Joseph Harmon's house was large in the way that things built by people who are not trying to impress anyone are large, practical, and permanent, with old trees in the yard and a kitchen that smelled like coffee that had been made hours ago. He poured 2 cups without asking and set them on the table and sat down, and he did not say anything while Wyatt laid out the documents. He listened for an hour and 40 minutes. He asked 3 questions, each of them precise. When Wyatt finished, Harmon was quiet for a long time, looking at the papers spread across the kitchen table. I've been watching the quarterly numbers for 6 months, Harmon said finally. I knew something was wrong. I didn't have anyone inside. I was certain I could trust. He still held 14% of Nexara's outstanding shares, the stake he had retained when stepping back from the daily chairmanship. Under the company's governance bylaws, an extraordinary general meeting of shareholders could be called if shareholders representing more than 25% of outstanding stock submitted a formal demand. Harmon had 14%. He needed more. Give me 90 days, Wyatt said. Harmon looked at him across the table. And at the end of 90 days? At the end of 90 days, you'll have everything you need. Not suspicions, not internal reports that can be buried. Evidence that cannot be disputed in any room. Harmon picked up his coffee cup. He was quiet for another moment. Then he nodded. It was not an enthusiastic nod. It was the nod of a man who has been in enough difficult rooms to know that certainty is earned, not assumed. But it was a yes. 11% of Nexara's shares were held by Sebastian Cross, a private investor who had been one of the company's earliest outside backers and who had watched the Giselle Monroe era with increasing unease. He was not a man who moved quickly. He was a man who needed to be shown things rather than told them, which was a distinction Wyatt understood precisely. He requested a meeting through Cross's office and was given a Thursday at 2 o'clock at Cross's private office in the financial district. Cross was already seated when Wyatt arrived, and he did not stand up. He looked at Wyatt the way he looked at most things, with patient, unhurried skepticism. I know who you are, Cross said. I know you were fired 3 weeks ago. So tell me why I should treat anything you say as something other than the grievance of a terminated employee. Wyatt did not argue with the framing. He set a document on the desk, not the full 41-page report, but a 23-page financial analysis he had rebuilt from scratch, using only information available in Nexara's public filings, cross-referenced against public corporate registry data. He had spent 2 weeks on it. Every single data point in it was independently verifiable. You don't have to take my word for anything, Wyatt said. Read page 23. Cross read. He read slowly, with the focused stillness of someone who has spent decades evaluating things that other people had tried to make look better than they were. When he got to the section on Vantage Capital Partners, he stopped. He went back. He read it again. How far does this go? Cross asked. Far enough, Wyatt said. But I need more time to build a complete picture before anything is put in front of a board. Cross leaned back. What do you need from me? Not yet. I need you to be ready. When I come back to you, I'll have everything. And I'll need your 11% standing next to Harmon's 14. Cross looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, Come back with the full picture. I'll be here. Charlotte Voss reached out in the 4th week through an encrypted messaging application she had downloaded the day after Wyatt was fired. She had not told anyone. She sent a short message. I have documents you haven't seen. I want to talk. They met in a coffee shop 3 miles from the Nexara offices, at 7 in the morning before either of them could be observed by anyone from the company. Charlotte was composed, but tired in the way of someone who has not been sleeping. She had brought a small folder. "I'm a witness to things I didn't fully understand when they were happening," she said. "I signed off on paperwork that I now realize was structured to misdirect. I want you to understand that I didn't know what it was being used for." Wyatt listened. He did not rush her. He had learned, in the years of raising a child alone, that the most important things people needed to say were usually the things they needed the most space to say, and that filling the space prematurely was a way of preventing the very thing you were trying to hear. She had email chains showing explicit instructions from Giselle Monroe to Nexara's internal finance team to reclassify specific consulting expenditures under a capital investment budget category, which carried different disclosure requirements and delayed board-level review. She had a signed approval form for a board meeting minutes document, except the document she had signed and the document currently on file in Nexara's governance records were not the same. The dates had been altered. 2 lines of recorded discussion had been removed. The version on file indicated board awareness and tacit approval of the preliminary divestiture terms. The version Charlotte had signed indicated no such thing. "Charlotte," Wyatt said carefully, "if you give me these, and this goes where it needs to go, there will come a point where your name is attached to this. I can't protect you from the professional consequences of that. I can tell you that the legal exposure for you is minimal. You didn't act with intent. But I won't make you a promise I can't keep." Charlotte looked down at the folder. She was quiet for a long time. "I've worked in human resources for 16 years, she said finally. "I've handed people termination letters. I know exactly what it looks like when something is done to someone that isn't right." She slid the folder across the table. "I know what it looked like that morning with you." Wyatt took the folder. He did not say thank you immediately. He said, "What you're doing takes more than most people understand." "It takes exactly as much as it should," Charlotte said. By week 8, Wyatt had compiled a file that was no longer a report. It was a case. He brought it to Diana Marsh, an independent corporate attorney whom Harmon had worked with before the board's transition, and whose contract Giselle had quietly declined to renew in her first year. Diana was precise and unsentimental. She did not speculate. She did not frame things in terms of what might be true or what seemed likely. She framed things only in terms of what could be proven, what could be documented, and what would hold in a formal proceeding. She read through the full documentation over 2 days and then called Wyatt with her assessment. "The financial misclassification is a governance violation at minimum and potentially rises to securities fraud given the disclosure implications," she said. "The altered board minutes are a more serious problem. That's document fraud, and it directly implicates personal liability for the CEO. And the beneficial ownership connection to Vantage Capital Partners, if we can close the remaining gap in the ownership chain, constitutes self-dealing under the company charter, and likely under state corporate law as well. Can we close the gap? I have a firm I work with for forensic corporate registry analysis. Give me 2 more weeks." The gap was closed in week 10. The forensic analysis traced the beneficial ownership of the offshore holding company that had funded Vantage Capital Partners through 3 intermediary entities to a personal trust established in Giselle Monroe's name 4 years prior. The paper wall was real. It was also navigable if you had the right tools and enough time. Diana began preparing the formal demand for an extraordinary general meeting. She also made quiet contact with 2 independent board members, the 2 who had voted against Giselle's appointment in the original confirmation and who had remained unaligned in the months since. Neither of them committed to anything in writing, but neither of them pushed back. In week 10, Giselle Monroe summoned Charlotte Voss to her office. She had not directly asked about Wyatt before that point, which Charlotte had found more unsettling than if she had. The question, when it came, was framed as casual, just checking in, just making sure there was no residual communication with former employees that might create legal complications. "Has Aldrin been in touch with anyone here?" Charlotte kept her expression neutral. She had rehearsed this. "Not that I'm aware of," she said. It was the first outright lie of her professional life. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. She walked back to her office and sat down and stared at her desk for 3 minutes before she could return to her work. Giselle had also hired a private investigator. Wyatt had assumed this was possible since week 5, which was why every meeting with Harmon and Cross after that point had been arranged through Diana's office in venues that had no connection to any of the principals. The investigator found nothing useful, but the fact that Giselle had hired one told Wyatt something about her internal state that no document could have communicated more clearly. She was no longer certain she had won. In the final week of the 90 days, Sebastian Cross received a phone call from Giselle Monroe. She was warm in a way she had not previously been with him, and she made an offer to purchase his entire 11% stake at a premium of 18 points above the current market valuation. It was a large number. It was the kind of number that was meant to make a person set aside whatever else they were thinking about. Cross listened politely. He said he would consider it. He ended the call and sent Wyatt a 2-sentence message. "She's offering to buy me out at a significant premium. She's panicking." Wyatt read the message and did not respond right away. He was sitting in his kitchen, Levi asleep down the hall, the apartment quiet. He thought about Giselle in her office, running the calculations that she was now forced to run, beginning to understand the dimensions of what was closing around her. He did not feel satisfaction about it. He felt something more like recognition, the specific, impersonal sense of watching a consequence arrive at the exact speed it was always going to arrive at. On day 87, Joseph Harmon, Sebastian Cross, and 2 independent board members signed the formal demand for an extraordinary general meeting of Nexara Group shareholders. Their combined holdings represented 34% of outstanding stock, 9 points above the threshold required under the company's governing documents. The demand was served on the board chair at 4:17 in the afternoon. Giselle Monroe received notification at 4:52. That evening, for the first time since she had handed Wyatt a termination letter on his son's birthday, Giselle Monroe could not sleep. The morning of the extraordinary general meeting, Wyatt stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom and put on a suit he had not worn in 3 years. It was the suit he had been wearing on the day Joseph Harmon had promoted him to senior advisor, charcoal gray, well-made, slightly loose across the shoulders now, because he was a bit leaner than he had been before everything changed. He adjusted the collar. He looked at himself for a moment, without any particular expression. He was not rehearsing what he was going to say. He already knew exactly what he was going to say, because the work of the last 90 days had already done the speaking for him. In the kitchen, Levi was eating cereal. He looked up when Wyatt came in. "You look different," Levi said. "Different how?" Levi thought about it. "Like you did something already, even though you haven't left yet." Wyatt poured coffee. He stood at the counter and drank it. "I'll be home by dinner," he said. The meeting was held in the 18th floor conference room of Nexara's headquarters tower, the same building from which Wyatt had been walked out 90 days earlier. The room could seat 42 people at the main table, with additional chairs along the wall. By 9:55, nearly all of those seats were filled. Board members, major shareholders, institutional investor representatives, legal counsel for multiple parties. The room had the particular texture of a space in which everyone present understood that something irreversible was about to happen, and no one yet knew exactly which direction it would fall. People spoke quietly to the person beside them. Water glasses were filled and left untouched. The air had the specific density of consequence held temporarily in suspension. Giselle Monroe sat at the head of the table in her capacity as sitting CEO. She was composed. She had prepared. Her legal team had filed a preliminary brief the day before, arguing that the demand for the meeting was procedurally flawed, that the documentation underlying it had been obtained improperly, and that the entire proceeding should be deferred pending an independent review. She was not going to make this easy. She had not become what she was by making things easy. Wyatt sat midway down the table beside Joseph Harmon and Diana Marsh. When Giselle looked at him, and she did look, briefly, once, as the room was settling, he met her eyes without any change in expression. He nodded. She looked away first. Giselle's lead attorney opened the session by lodging a formal objection. The demand, he argued, rested substantially on documents provided by a former employee who had been terminated for cause documents, whose provenance and chain of custody could not be certified, and whose disclosure, may have violated existing confidentiality. Kovno, he requested a 60-day deferral. Diana Marsh waited until he had finished completely. Then she responded in a tone that was entirely pleasant and entirely unbending. She cited 3 specific provisions of state corporate law governing shareholder rights in extraordinary general meetings. She cited 2 relevant court decisions. She noted that the confidentiality provisions referenced by opposing counsel contained an explicit carve-out standard in most employment agreements, exempting disclosures made in connection with the reporting of potential fraud or illegal conduct to appropriate parties. She observed that the preliminary brief filed the previous day contained a material misrepresentation regarding when Nexara's audit committee had formally acknowledged receipt of Wyatt's original internal report, and she set the correct date on the record. The objection was denied. The presentation of evidence proceeded in 3 layers. The way a sound building is constructed: foundation first, then structure, then everything that makes it permanent. The first layer was financial. An independent forensic accounting firm presented an analysis of 14 months of Nexara's cash flows, showing 37 instances in which consulting expenditures had been reclassified in ways that altered their disclosure timing and delayed board-level review. The aggregate amount involved was $11.4 million. The presentation was dry, precise, and completely incomprehensible to explain away. The second layer was documentary. Diana introduced the 2 versions of the board meeting minutes, the signed original from Charlotte Voss's files, and the version currently archived in Nexara's governance records. She placed them side by side on the display screen at the end of the room. The differences were highlighted. 2 passages of recorded discussion, deleted. The date of a preliminary agreement notation, changed by 19 days. A line attributing awareness to all board members present, added where none had existed. One of the board members, a woman named Eleanor Stearns, who had been quietly attentive throughout the entire proceeding, set her pen down on the table and looked directly at Giselle. She did not ask a question. The look itself was the question. The third layer was the ownership chain. Diana walked through the forensic corporate registry analysis step by step. She named each intermediary entity. She showed each connection. She placed the final document, the trust registration, on the screen, the one bearing Giselle Monroe's name as beneficial owner, and she let the room absorb it without commentary for a full 15 seconds. Giselle's attorney attempted a rebuttal. He argued that the beneficial ownership connections were circumstantial, that the divestiture had not yet been completed, that the preliminary negotiations were within the CEO's executive authority, that no final harm had occurred. He was thorough. He was well prepared. And he was arguing against a room in which every person present could read the document on the screen. Giselle spoke once in her own defense. Her voice did not waver. She looked around the table at the faces she had worked with and argued with and managed and occasionally outmaneuvered over the previous 18 months, and she said, "Every decision I made was within the scope of my authority as CEO. The people questioning those decisions include a man who does not hold any formal position within this company." Joseph Harmon spoke for the first time in the proceeding. He was brief. He did not raise his voice. He set a document on the table, a single stapled document, not large, certified by a notary, and he spoke to the room without looking at any of the screens. "This is the original signed minutes from the board meeting of 14 months ago," he said. "I signed that document. I was present for that meeting. The version currently in Nexara's governance archive is not the document I signed. I remember the meeting. I remember what we discussed. I remember specifically what was not discussed." He paused. "I would like to know who changed it." The room was completely silent. Eleanor Stearns looked at Giselle and asked, with perfect courtesy, "Do you have a response to that?" Giselle looked at her attorney. Her attorney lowered his eyes to the table. The vote on the motion to remove Giselle Monroe from the position of Chief Executive Officer was conducted by written ballot and tallied by Diana Marsh and the board's independent secretary. The result was 7 votes in favor, 2 opposed. The 2 opposed were both members who owed their board seats to appointments made during Giselle's tenure. The result was read aloud. The room absorbed it. Several people made notes. One person asked a procedural question about interim management structure. The machinery of governance continued to turn. the way it always does, indifferent to the human temperature of the moment. Wyatt did not look at Giselle when the result was announced. He was looking at his own hands, which were flat on the table, which were perfectly still. Joseph Harmon rose and formally nominated Wyatt Aldrin to serve as interim chairman of the board for the period of stabilization and restructuring. Sebastian Cross immediately seconded the motion. 2 additional board members added their concurrence before any formal vote was called. The final tally was 8 in favor, 1 abstained. Giselle Monroe stood. She smoothed her jacket. She looked at Wyatt directly, without evasion, for what felt like a long time, but was probably 5 seconds. He met her eyes. There was nothing he wanted to communicate. There was nothing that needed to be said. She turned and walked to the door and opened it and left. And the door closed behind her, with the ordinary sound that doors make, neither dramatic nor quiet, just the sound of a thing that has been closed. Wyatt sat still for a moment longer. Around him, the room was beginning to shift into the lower key of practical conversation next steps, press statements, legal protocols. Diana was already on her phone. Harmon was speaking quietly with Sebastian Cross. The world was moving forward with the efficiency of people who have been waiting for a specific thing to happen, and who, now that it has happened, know exactly what to do next. Before he stood up, Wyatt looked down the row of chairs along the wall, where Charlotte Voss was seated. She had been invited as a formal witness, the only non-shareholder, non-counsel individual in the room. She was looking at him. She did not look relieved. She looked like someone who had made a decision and was sitting with the full weight of it. He walked over to her after the room had begun to clear. "Thank you, Charlotte. I just did what was right," she said. "That's the hardest thing in the world to do," Wyatt said. "Every single time." She nodded. They did not say anything else. There was nothing else that needed to be said. He left the building the same way he had 90 days earlier, through the main lobby, past the security desk, out through the glass doors and onto the sidewalk where the afternoon light was coming in low and flat. He stood there for a moment. The city moved around him. He took out his phone and sent one text message to the woman who was at home with Levi. "On my way. Tell him to pick what we have for dinner." He drove home through the late afternoon. He did not turn on the radio. Levi was at the kitchen table when he came in, working through a drawing that appeared to involve a very large dog and a series of geometric shapes whose function was unclear. He looked up when Wyatt appeared in the doorway. He studied his father's face with the quiet assessment that he had developed over 3 years of being the only other person in the house. "Did it work?" Levi asked. Wyatt put his keys on the counter. He began taking off his jacket. "Yes," he said. "It worked." "Did you win?" Wyatt hung the jacket over the back of a chair. He thought about the word, the thing it included, and the thing it left out. "Something like it," he said. Levi seemed to find this acceptable. He returned to his drawing. "Can we have pasta?" "We can have whatever you want." His phone had been buzzing in his pocket since he got in the car. Reporters, probably, board members, legal notifications, administrative emails beginning the process of transfer and restructuring that would take months to fully work through. He silenced it without looking at it and put it face down on the counter. Not tonight. All of that was real, and all of it would need to be attended to, but not before pasta, and not before Levi finished the drawing with the geometric shapes. He did look at it once, sometime after dinner, when Levi was in the bath and the kitchen was quiet. One message from an unknown number, a 10-digit number he did not recognize. The message 3 sentences long. It said, "I should have said this sooner. What you built here took more than I understood. Congratulations." He looked at it for a moment. He did not reply. He deleted the message and set the phone down and went to check on Levi. His first morning as interim chairman, Wyatt arrived at the Nexara building at 7:45. The lobby was mostly empty at that hour. A few early arriving staff, the building maintenance team finishing their rounds, the overnight security guard handing off to the day shift. The day shift guard was the same man who had stood behind Giselle Monroe 90 days earlier, who had been part of the formal escort out of the building. He was a large, quiet man named Paul, and when he saw Wyatt come through the main doors, he gave a single slow nod. Wyatt nodded back. The chairman's office on the 22nd floor had not been cleared since Harmon had stopped using it regularly. There were no personal items left in it. Harmon had taken those long ago, but there was the particular stillness of a room that has been holding its breath. The furniture was good. The windows faced east. The morning light came in at an angle that would disappear by 10 o'clock as the sun shifted. Wyatt set his bag down on the desk. He took one thing out and placed it on the surface in front of him before he did anything else. A photograph, printed on regular paper and slipped inside a simple frame the previous evening after Levi had gone to sleep, the photograph from Levi's birthday. The boy leaning forward over 7 candles, his face lit from below, his eyes closed in the serious concentration of a wish. He stood for a moment looking at it. Then he sat down. At 9 o'clock, he called the first meeting. He asked every senior leader in the company to come to the main conference room. When they were seated, some of them guarded, some of them visibly uncertain, all of them waiting to understand who this man was now and what he intended. Wyatt stood at the head of the table and did not deliver a speech. He said, "We're going to start by being honest with each other about where the company actually is, not where it's supposed to look like it is, where it is. Everyone in this room can speak. No one in this room will be penalized for telling the truth." He paused. "That's all. Let's begin." The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone at the far end of the table set down their pen and began to talk. And then someone else. And then someone else after that. It was, in the end, a very ordinary beginning to an extraordinary piece of work, which was exactly how Wyatt had always believed the most important things should begin. There are things that cannot be taken from a person, no matter how completely and deliberately someone sets out to take them. He had understood this first in the worst way, standing in a hospital corridor 3 years ago, watching the world rearrange itself permanently around a new kind of loss. He had understood it again, more quietly, in the parking structure of this building, with a small birthday cake on the seat beside him, and a note in his jacket pocket, and everything he had built inside these walls, suddenly removed. Dignity is not a position. It is not a title, or a salary, or an office on any floor of any building. It is something a person either carries or doesn't. It cannot be granted by a board vote, and it cannot be revoked by a white envelope on a desk. Wyatt had carried his out the door on the morning of his son's 7th birthday, tucked inside a smile that no one in that room had been able to read. He had carried it through 90 days of quiet, methodical, unhurried work. He had carried it into a room full of people and set it down on a table in the form of evidence, and he had let the evidence do what evidence does when it is real. He was still carrying it now. That was the only part that had never been in question.